Sweatshirts. Everyone wears them, and they become far more interesting with some designer touches. I'm Mary Mulari, and I'm here to share with you the techniques and ideas from my Designer Sweatshirts book. I'll be showing you step by step through many of the methods described in this book, and I hope that you'll feel encouraged and inspired to work on your own designer sweatshirts. Any project that we begin always starts off with a list of supplies and equipment that we need. I have a basket here full of some sweatshirts that are all set to stitch on. This is a group and an array of colors of purchased sweatshirts. You may be wanting to make your own sweatshirts, and that's certainly a fine option. But I find that many people like to start with a shirt that's already put together, and they simply have the fun of decorating it. I've chosen this shirt to consider as a possibility for a designer sweatshirt. It's a nice lavender mauve type of color, and I'd like to encourage you to start with a shirt that's either brand new or nearly new. The problem comes when we decide to use that shirt from the back of the closet that we use to mop the floors. After a while, it really looks pretty tough, and we want something that will look as nice for as long as possible. So our next job will be to select some fabrics that coordinate with the color of the sweatshirt. One possibility is a group of pastel calicos, some tiny prints and a pin dot, and these together might work well to enhance the color of the sweatshirt. Another possibility that you might like would be a grouping of dark solid colors, and we might use an Amish theme when we go to select our alteration or our decorations for this sweatshirt. An important detail that goes along with the fabric is thread color. I think it's so important that we pay attention so that our thread matches as closely as possible to the color of the fabric. It's a way that we build in a very professional look into our sewing, to have matching thread. Then we need to have some interfacing. I like to use the tricot style interfacing. It's very soft and it gives. This is also a fusible so that the back of the interfacing is kind of rough and grainy, has a bit of a shine to it here, and it seems to me to be very compatible with the softness and the stretchability that we like so much in sweatshirt fabric. When we buy interfacing, we often get with it a set of instructions, and we don't always know what to do with these. They get in the way. I'd like to suggest that you make yourself a little envelope or pocket from one set of the instructions. I've used some Scotch tape to seal up the edges of this set of instructions, and in this I will store the interfacing that goes along with the instructions. I think it will help you next time you want to use this interfacing. Your instructions will be here very handy. We also need some basic supplies, things that you normally will have in your sewing room, like a pair of scissors. A tape measure is something that we'll be using often, and a yardstick is also very handy. And beside that, our iron, a very, very important sewing tool. I like to say that as long as the light on your sewing machine is on, the iron should be on. It should be nearby and convenient to use. We need to be ironing each seam that we stitch. And another tool that we don't always like to think about, but one that's awfully important, is a seam ripper. If it's handy and nearby, it's quick to use, and we can go on with more fun details of our project. Many of these tools I keep in a little basket at my ironing board or my sewing machine, and so I can quickly grab for them, and I make an attempt at least to be a little bit organized, and it makes sewing go much nicer. In the past few years, some new kinds of equipment have been invented that can be very helpful to us when we stitch. The first one I'd like to talk about is the glue stick. This rather overgrown looking tube of lipstick that is white and gummy when we open it up. And with the glue stick, we're able to attach two pieces of fabric together very simply. We would rub the glue stick on the back of a piece of fabric that we're going to attach to our sweatshirt body, just a little bit of it, and then we attach it in the place where we want the design or the fabric to be located, and then without pins we can take this to our sewing machine and stitch this on. Sometimes pins get in the way, and having a glue stick handy is very helpful and useful. It will not gum up your sewing machine needle as long as you use a moderate amount, and it washes out when you no longer need it also. Then we have another form of glue. This is dry glue or stitch witchery. To me it always looks like a sheet of spider webs all pressed together. This is a piece off the bolt. It's about 18 inches wide, and another form it comes in is this roll, which is about 3/4 of an inch wide. Very handy. And with this we are able also to fuse two pieces of fabric together. This time we need to have a block of stitch witchery cut. I've already done this here, and I'll cut a piece of fabric just slightly larger than the piece of stitch witchery so that I don't mess up my iron, and then I will layer this on my sweatshirt. I will put the stitch witchery down first and then the fabric right side up, and then using my iron and pressing and holding, I will fuse the two pieces together. By using stitch witchery, again we can avoid the use of pins. The next tool is a very handy one. It's a marking pen with 2 points on it. We'll look at the blue side first. This has a very nice sharp point, and it looks like a pen that you might use to write a letter to a friend. We use this on fabric, and we can make very sharp, distinct marks, like this X. And we can mark buttonholes, we can mark a lot of things that we need for our sewing. The nice part about the blue mark is that when you use water, when you don't want the mark there anymore, we're going to simply wet the fabric and the mark is gone. The pen also has a purple point, and we're going to use that in a similar way because it again has that nice sharp point, and the X I draw here can be removed just as easily with the water, but on its own it will disappear in 24 hours or so, even less time if it's very humid out. So I would suggest that if you're a slow worker, you might use the blue pen first of all. The last piece of equipment that I'd like to talk about is a little squirt bottle of fray check. It's not a very impressive looking bottle of clear liquid, but what this will do is to prevent fraying on the cut edge of a piece of fabric. Unless you want to turn back this edge or zigzag, you might have the problems of fabric fraying. But if you treat this with a little bit of fray check run down the edge of the cut, this, when it dries, will be clear on most fabrics, and it will permanently prevent the edge from fraying. Very, very handy tool for mending. It also stops runs in pantyhose and also on the edges of very narrow ribbon that you want to use for trim. You may be disappointed when you hear me suggest that the first place you take your brand new sweatshirt is to the laundry room and wash it before you begin to sew. Many women say to me, "Gosh, I'd like to decorate this for my cousin for her birthday, and I really hate to launder it first." But believe me, you'll save your cousin a lot of problems by laundering this garment before you decorate it. One of the problems with sweatshirts can be the color. This is a nice bright color, but you don't want everything that's laundered with it forever afterwards to turn light lavender. So we want to set the color into the garment. And we can do that as I'm showing here with a dishpan of water. I'm going to just wash one sweatshirt, and I'm going to add some white vinegar to the water to set the color. When I add the white vinegar, I would probably pour about 1/4 cup into my dishpan of water. In other words, not just a drop or two, but a fairly significant amount will set the color. Before I put the sweatshirt into the water, I'm going to do one very important thing, and that will be to turn the sweatshirt inside out. What this will do is to put the agitation from the washing machine on the fleece side or the wrong side of the sweatshirt. This will protect the outer side, and that's the side we want to stay nicer looking anyway. So we'll always launder the sweatshirt inside out before we put it into the water. You will, of course, wring this out, and possibly you might want to put it into the dryer. But on garments that are cotton or at least part natural fibers, I like to suggest that you limit the time in the clothes dryer. And you might even want to completely air dry the sweatshirt after it's washed. Next, I suggest to you that you should launder the fabrics that you use to trim the sweatshirt. These come to us from the factory with sizing in them, and sizing is hard on sewing machine needles, and it gives that nice crisp finish. We want to launder these. You might do these in a bunch in your washing machine and dry them in your dryer. The other thing that I suggest that you launder before you begin is the fusible interfacing. The bolt will say that it's pre-shrunk, but this too has sizing in it that we want to remove. So we'll dip this into our dishpan, and we would of course have to launder this by hand and certainly not put it in the clothes dryer. You'd have a new lining for your dryer drum. So hang this fusible interfacing to drip dry. Once everything is dry, then we're ready to take our supplies to the sewing room and start on the fun project of sewing and designer sweatshirts. Okay, I'll admit, this won't be the most glamorous of the alterations that we'll do, but to be able to shorten a sweatshirt is an important alteration that you might sometimes be able to use. Let's look at this shirt first of all. This is an adult sweatshirt size medium. If you purchase an adult sweatshirt, you are actually purchasing a sweatshirt built for a man. For many women, this is an uncomfortable fit. The length of a sweatshirt is often dictated by fashion also. Many women find that an adult sweatshirt needs to be shortened. They try on, for example, a large adult sweatshirt, and it fits fine around the neck, and it fits smoothly and loosely over the bust line. Perhaps the sleeves are a little long, but they can live with that. But the problem is in the length. The ribbing comes down to below seat level on them or on a place where it rides very uncomfortably. Then in the middle is a lot of excess fabric, and they really don't know what they should do with it. So to shorten the garment for this type of person is a very helpful thing. The shirt we have on the other side has already been shortened. This is to correspond with many of the fashions of today, more of a cropped look. So I can show you that from this sweatshirt, I removed this whole section of the body, and I also shortened the ribbing by cutting this much off. So you can see that the ribbing is shorter, and the whole look of the shirt is a little different from the one here on this side. There are two different ways to shorten a sweatshirt that I'll share with you, and we'll start by considering the one where we cut the amount we've chosen from the body of the shirt. Here at my cutting table, I have a sweatshirt that nearly is ready to be shortened. I have my short ruler and my marking pen, and I have tried this shirt on and determined that I can remove 2 inches from the bottom of the body of the sweatshirt. So I have used my ruler and my marker to place marks all around the shirt 2 inches above the ribbing. After I have made all of these marks all the way around the shirt, I can use my scissor and remove, first of all, the ribbing. I'll poke the end of my scissor into the ditch, or that crack between the ribbing and the body of the sweatshirt. And I'll begin to cut, and I'm going to cut this carefully all the way around the shirt to remove the ribbing. I've just removed the ribbing from the sweatshirt, and the next cut will be to remove that 2-inch band of fabric from all the way around the shirt. Let's begin. Here's the 2-inch band that was removed from the sweatshirt. So now we have a sweatshirt that is, of course, a lot shorter, and there's no ribbing on the bottom. Next, we are going to mark the quarter portions on both the bottom of the sweatshirt and the ribbing. I've already placed some purple marks here. This is the center of my ribbing and the 2 side seams and the center back. And I've done the same to the body of the sweatshirt. Here is the center front. Here is the side. Another one over here, and the center back. The next job will be to put the binding back onto the sweatshirt and pin it into position, matching the marks of the quarter portions. Here is center back, match to center back. Here on the sides, we'll match these seams. In the middle of each portion, I'm going to stretch both the ribbing and the body of the sweatshirt just slightly so they match up, and I will be placing pins in the middle to securely hold the ribbing back on to the body of the sweatshirt. And I'll continue by treating each quarter portion in the same way. Now that I've finished pinning the binding back onto the shirt, I'm ready to sew the binding back on the new location. Here at the sewing machine, I can adjust the machine to do an elastic overlock type of stitch. This will attach the binding and overcast the edge all at the same time. If you don't have a similar stitch, but you do have a zigzag stitch, you may like to consider using a very small zigzag at this time and stretching just slightly on the fabrics as you stitch. Remember that it's important to build some stretchability into this seam. We have to be able to get our body into this garment, and if it doesn't stretch, the seam will pop, and then we're going to have some problems. So let's stitch this on with an elastic overlock type of stitch. I'm finishing up the first half of this sweatshirt, and then I want to show you how we can also attach this binding by using the serger. If you own a serger, this step of attaching the binding to the sweatshirt can be very speedily done. Now that the sweatshirt is shortened, you can see that this is sort of an invisible type of alteration, but I think a very important one because many women especially will find this garment to be far more comfortable now that it's shorter and the ribbing is resting in a different position on their body. There's another fine way to shorten sweatshirts, and that is to add tucks to the body of the sweatshirt. Here I have added 3 tucks to this yellow sweatshirt, and this is easy to do, and I'll show you on my sample how we proceed. Here on this yellow sweatshirt, I have begun to place 3 rows of marks onto the body of the garment. The first mark comes about 3 inches above the ribbing. This is something that you can judge for yourself according to the sweatshirt you're altering. But I have determined that I can place 3 half-inch tucks into this garment to shorten it to the correct length. The marks that I have drawn indicate the center of the tuck. And by that I mean the fold line that happens down here at the bottom of the tuck. That's what I mean by the center of the tuck. I will proceed then to mark the entire shirt with this set of 3 rows of marks, and then I'm going to pick the shirt up and create a fold on the bottom row of marks. I'll pin this entire fold into place all the way around the shirt, and then I can take this garment to the sewing machine and sew along this edge. If I've determined a 1/2 inch, that's how far I will sew all the way around the shirt. Let me show you on another sampler what this might look like. Here is the row of marks, and here's the fold that I've created, and I have stitched with navy blue thread about 1/2 inch in. This creates an interesting look of texture here at the bottom of the garment, and I think it might be something that you might like to try. It could also be something you might do to shorten the sleeve. The best ways to add comfort to the neckline of a sweatshirt is to add a placket to the neckline. There are 3 choices for locating this placket. We can start with the center front placket here on this pink sweatshirt. Another choice is a raglan seam placket, and yet another choice is here on the shoulder. Any of these 3 locations, we use the same type of procedure for applying the placket. And I think that one of the reasons we like to add plackets is because we put on a new sweatshirt for the first time, and you may find that your hand goes automatically to the neckline, and you want to stretch this out so that you have a little more breathing room, a little more comfort. By adding a placket, we build in a little more give, a little more room for ourselves, and the shirt becomes more comfortable. Let's go to the work table to start the procedure of adding a placket to the neckline of a sweatshirt. My lavender sweatshirt is marked for a center front placket location, and I'd like to refer to page 36 of Designer Sweatshirts, to the page where I have a placket pattern guide. Instead of cutting the book apart, I'd suggest that you make a tracing. And here I've made a tracing of the placket pattern, though it's a little shorter than the one in the book. And I'm ready now to cut some fabric for the plackets of my sweatshirt. This is a fairly standard adult placket. It's about 6 inches long, but you'll notice that my placket pattern is longer than the placket will actually be. I suggest that you add at least 2 inches to the measurement of your placket so that you have adequate fabric and don't have to worry about recutting another placket. This pattern features a line that is to be placed on the fold of the fabric on this left edge, and on the right there's seam allowance planned. This is about 1/4 inch. It's not very wide, so you may wish to add a wider seam allowance on this side. This is completely adjustable to your own needs and preferences. Here are 2 plackets that I've cut. You'll need to cut 2 of these, and they're exactly alike. Here's the fold of the fabric, and so when we open this up, it's a double piece of fabric, and both pieces are exactly alike. The next step will be to add a little bit of interfacing to these pieces of fabric. Now you'll notice when I open this that my interfacing comes to the fold line and then extends to the edge of the seam allowance. And I've done the same thing on both of these pieces. You may find that you would prefer to add more interfacing, so you can extend that to both halves. I like to add some stability and firmness, but I'm a little concerned about making this placket too stiff and too thick. So that is why I add interfacing to only half of the placket. Next, we'll open up the seam allowance, but we've ironed it back originally so that we line up both edges exactly alike, so that both pieces are precisely the same. This will help us a lot later on in this process. But then I'm going to open these up so the raw edges are now showing again on both pieces, and I'll place them to overlap, so that they overlap only where the interfacing lies inside each placket, and the seam allowances are extended off over the edges. And in this position, we will bring our plackets to the bottom of the sweatshirt location and pin these into place. I must admit this is a little strange. Most placket directions don't ask you to proceed in this way, but I think that you will see this is a very fine way to apply a placket and can avoid the homemade look that we can often get. Now let's take this to the sewing machine and prepare to sew these pieces onto the sweatshirt. Here at the sewing machine, I'm going to follow the advice that is often given to carpenters, that is to measure twice and saw or sew once. I'm going to flip up my placket pieces to check to see how this placket will open. And I notice here that it will be opening from the left. And I think that I would prefer to have it open from the right. So to make this change, I'm going to unpin these two placket pieces and flip this over, both pieces, and place them here again in this location, pin them back down, and now I'm ready to sew. Gee, I'm really glad that I checked that. When you insert the sweatshirt under the presser foot, it takes a little bit of maneuvering. You have to make sure that the back side of the sweatshirt is out of the way and you're not catching more than you want to be sewing. Our first seam is going to be very short, and we'll get the presser foot here at the placket ends. And you might also like to shorten your stitch length slightly so that you have a good strong seam sewing these two pieces of fabric into place on the sweatshirt. I'll just double check to make sure I'm not sewing on the back of my garment. And then I'm going to sew only in the areas on these placket pieces where there is interfacing. And I'll try to do the very best job of sewing straight across. And stopping just short of the seam allowance. You might like to sew in reverse a little bit also. The next step will be to do a cut. This is the time when sometimes people like to get a little nervous, but don't worry about it. You really can't ruin this sweatshirt. But let's look first of all at this short seam. Do you see that I haven't stitched on my seam allowances? They're still loose. I'll remove the pins, and now I can cut my neck open. I can follow the line that I drew earlier on the front of the sweatshirt. I'm going to cut straight down and stop about an inch or so away from my stitching line. And then I'm going to very carefully cut two angle cuts. And I'll bend away my seam allowance and cut all the way to the end of the stitching here. And on the other side, I will do the same thing, very carefully and accurately. So do you see that I have cut in this sweatshirt front a Y? The next step with the plackets is to tuck the seam allowances back inside as we had earlier ironed them. Obviously this one is on top, so we'll work with this one first. I've tucked in the seam allowances, and here at the bottom I have some little ears of fabric that don't seem to want to cooperate very well, but they won't be a problem because I'm going to tuck the edge of the line on the sweatshirt that I just cut right inside this placket. Do you see how nice and neatly that falls into place? And I'm going to pin this down. Because we have earlier taken the care to iron both edges very evenly and neatly, it will be easy to pin this into place to prepare to sew it. Here at the top, you'll notice I have a lot of extra fabric. Now I don't want to tuck that much in because it's going to be far too bulky here at the top, so I will trim some of this away. It's always, of course, better to have too much than too little at this point. Next, I can carefully tuck the edges of this top of the placket inside, and I try to do this as carefully as possible so it looks nice and straight with the ribbing. And I'll secure a pin here at the top. We'll proceed with the second half of the placket in the same way. We'll tuck in the seam allowance and then insert the second side of the neck opening here inside this half of the placket, tucking in these edges. If you work with this just a little bit, you'll be able to get the edge of the sweatshirt tucked inside. And you'll work your way up again and trim away from this edge and tuck this inside. After another pin or two is in place, we can then sew each side of the placket into place. I've just finished sewing the second side of my placket into place, and I'll show you what the placket looks like at this point. Both sides have been treated the same way. I begin to sew here at the bottom, I come up the side and across the top. I could have sewed down on this edge also if I wanted to. On the other side, I've done exactly the same thing. I think you can see the green thread stands out pretty well on this pink placket, and I certainly don't recommend you use green on pink, but I think it helps for you to see this. I sewed up and across. And my placket is nearly done now, except I think there's a very important last step of reinforcing. And that will be to line up the bottoms of both sides of the placket, one on top of the other. And I'll place a few pins here to secure these together very accurately. And now I'll sew through both sides of the placket to add some reinforcement. I've finished the placket, and I'd like to show you this last rectangle that I sewed here at the bottom to reinforce the placket. Now when I pull the sweatshirt over my head and this placket is forced open, the stress of the opening comes at the top of the rectangle and makes this a very firm and neat closure. Notice the bottom of the placket, how neat and smooth it is. If you've struggled with plackets before, you know that this is the place where they often look very homemade. I might use some closures for this placket, like buttons and buttonholes, or maybe some Velcro, or maybe I'll leave it open and loose for a very comfortable, casual neckline. Now that we've looked at plackets, let's look at another way to open the neckline of a sweatshirt. I think that the collar and front facings are an attractive way to open up the neckline of a sweatshirt. This shirt has lace added, and I've used two different kinds of fabric for each of the facings and for each side of the collar. Here's another example of this same alteration done for a child. Here the same fabric is used. Let's look at the way that we begin this process. I have here a gray sweatshirt with a center line drawn in with a blue washable marker. This is the first important step to determine the exact front center. In the back of the designer sweatshirt book, you'll find a front-facing pattern that looks like this. The directions tell you to cut two of these from fabric, and this is what will be located here at the center front of the neckline. I've cut two of these facings, which will be placed here, and you'll note that I've drawn, as the pattern suggests, a V here in the center, and this will be the guide for my stitching line when I sew these pieces onto my sweatshirt. I've prepared two other facings to suggest to you that you might want to do a little work before you sew. One of the facings has the edges and bottoms ironed back in a very neat way. And this will be placed here at the center front at the top. And on this facing, I have drawn the V stitching line, and you'll see here that I've finished the edge, not by turning the edges back, but zigzagging on this side and serging on this side, just to illustrate to you that you can choose either way of sealing the edge of this raw fabric. I will place the two facings with right sides together and pin the two facing pieces to the sweatshirt. And at this point, we're ready to sew the two facings to the sweatshirt. I've just finished stitching the V in the facing. Remove the pins and show you how I stitched. Though it looks like a V, I sewed down, and at the bottom I sewed across just one stitch, and then I sewed back up to the top. That one stitch here at the bottom might seem like a very unimportant detail, but it will help you when it comes time to turn the facing to the back, which is the next thing that we'll do. First of all, though, we've got to cut our neckline open. And so right between the stitching, make sure I don't cut through more than one layer of the sweatshirt. Right up to that end of that stitching. Now I can turn the facing to the back side of the sweatshirt. I might want to do a little pressing, and then I will pin this into place and sew the facing down. And after that, we're ready to talk about adding the collar to the sweatshirt. Right now, you're about halfway done with this alteration. There's just a few more steps to go. You can see that I've sewed the facings down, and I always sew from the front of the shirt because that's where I like my stitching to look nice and controlled. And now we're ready to measure this neckline to determine the length of the collar that we'll cut for this sweatshirt. I'm going to use my tape measure on edge and work my way slowly around the neckline, not stretching the ribbing out of shape, but trying to be as accurate as I can. And by using the tape measure on edge, I can be accurate. My measurement is about 15 inches for this particular neckline. And I would suggest that you add another inch to this measurement so you have seam allowance space, and this is the length to which you will cut the collar. The collar pattern that you will find in the book looks something like this, and this is actually only half of a collar because this line is placed on the fold. But you'll measure this neck edge according to your needs. Now, if I need a 16-inch collar, this measurement will be 8 inches or half of that measurement. My two collars look like this. I've placed them with right sides together, and I have interfaced one of the collars, so there's a little bit of stability here for this collar. I'm sure many of you have sewed collars together before, so this will look very familiar to you. I've sewed the two pieces together, I've trimmed the seam, and you'll note that my stitching does not begin until a ½ inch away from the neck edge of the collar. That will allow me to fit this onto the sweatshirt more easily. We then go ahead to pin the collar onto the neckline of the sweatshirt. And I'll begin by pinning only half of the collar inside the neckline, right here. And because I've measured so carefully, this will all fit into place very accurately. And then we can take this to the sewing machine to sew half of this collar in place. Half the collar is sewed on. This is what the seam will look like, and it's attached to the very top of the ribbing. I've been to the ironing board also and ironed back the other raw collar edge approximately 1/4 of an inch or so. And the next step will be to pull the collar over to the right side of the sweatshirt, and I would line up the pressed back edge right over the seam that I just sewed. And by putting some pins in place, we'll hide that earlier machine sewed seam. And this is one time where I'd suggest you take out your hand sewing needle and with a hidden stitch, hand sew this last edge of the collar into place. Now, I'm sure some of you groan when I suggest hand stitching, but this really gives a nice, neat look, and it won't take you so very long to do it. Just a few more pins and the collar will be ready for hand stitching. It looks very nice and neat when you finish. And this is what you have. A collar with facings, a nice loose open neck, and that's all there is to it. We can consider the cardigan as a fine example of an alteration for many different ages. Here I've sewed the cardigan front onto a royal blue sweatshirt, added a sailboat applique, and I think this would be a fine suggestion for a young boy. It could be used as a lightweight jacket for some parts of the year. And on the other end of the age scale, we have grandmother in the nursing home. And we'll consider grandmother's problems as we look at this yellow cardigan. Grandmother's always cold, so she'd like to wear a sweatshirt, but her problem is that she has arthritis, and it's very difficult for her to pull things over her head. So why not make a cardigan? The front will open up, and it'll be easier for grandmother to get into the sweatshirt. Also, if you're considering a sweatshirt for grandmother, let's think about some bright colors. Colors like the ones I'm holding here in my hand. These bright colors can really perk up the day at the nursing home, and grandmother might be really happy to receive a sweatshirt decorated in some very bright colors. To look at how we begin this procedure of cardigans, I'll move my samples aside and we'll begin measuring our cardigan. Here's another bright color that grandmother might like. We'll lay our sweatshirt flat on the table, and then it's very important to accurately mark the center front of the whole garment. I've already begun to place some center marks with my blue washable marking pen, and I'm going to continue with my yardstick to add a few more marks so I can be very accurate. Marking the center front. The next step will be to use these marks and the yardstick as a straight edge and draw a straight dark line from the top of the sweatshirt all the way to the bottom. Don't try to cheat here. Sometimes it's real tempting to mark it once here and call that enough, but it really isn't. We need that dark straight line to follow. Next we'll measure this mark, and I see that mine is 26 inches long from top to bottom. Earlier we talked about plackets, and we're going to look back to that same type of placket again. We'll be cutting a long, narrow strip of fabric, which is at least 2 inches longer than our sweatshirt measurement. And when I open this, you will probably recognize the fact that I have interfacing on half of the placket, and both of the pieces that I have cut are exactly the same. Interfacing also on this placket. I'm going to bring these to my sweatshirt and line them up right along the line I just drew. You'll notice that I'm placing the two pieces with their edges butting up right on the line that I drew on the front of the sweatshirt. The next step will be to pin these in place, and then we can sew them onto the sweatshirt. I finished pinning the cardigan fronts onto the sweatshirt. I've placed the half of the placket with the interfacing away from the center of the shirt. That will mean that when I've completed this alteration, the interfaced half will be inside the shirt. Let's begin to sew these two pieces onto the shirt. You'll notice that I'm starting from the bottom of the garment, and I'm going to use approximately a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but you can use more if you'd like. Now that I've sewed both of the plackets into place, we're ready to cut the front of the shirt open between the two stitching lines. This is the time too when you might be a little nervous, but you really can't ruin this. And the stitching that you've done will act as a type of stay stitching to reinforce the front of this garment. Now I've reached the end, and here we have an open sweatshirt. I've also been to the ironing board already, and I have ironed back the other raw edge of the placket piece. I've done that on both sides. And so when it comes time now to flip our placket over and bring it to the back side of the shirt, I'm going to use my pressed back edge to cover the seam that I just stitched to attach the placket to the front of the shirt garment. Here we have excess, just as we had before with the plackets. And so I'm going to trim some of this away so it won't be so bulky when I go to turn the end of this to the inside of the shirt. Of course, we'll place some pins to hold this all in place. And I would pin from the front, because this is where we'll be sewing to attach the cardigan placket into place. This looks quite neat. And again, here at the top, we might want to trim some excess away to get rid of the bulk and turn this edge back as well. Both halves of the cardigan front will be treated in this same way. And after placing a few more pins, we can take this to the sewing machine and stitch across the top, down the side, across the bottom. And you can add additional stitching if you'd like. To close the cardigan, you might like to add the traditional buttons and buttonholes, or you may like to consider other alternatives. And this is one that you might like. Here we have a cardigan vest. I've added a gingham placket, and these are the snaps that are pounded in, so they actually will snap open. You might like this closure as well. The cardigan is a very comfortable way to alter a sweatshirt and give it a designer look. Lettuce edging is a very nice feminine way to decorate the plain neckline of a sweatshirt. I have an example here to show you that it makes a very nice neckline, disguises the look of a plain sweatshirt, and another place that you can add lettuce edging is on the edge of the cuff to coordinate the whole shirt. To do this, all we need to do is work at the sewing machine, and with some thread we create the curly edging. If this is a new kind of sewing for you, you might like to practice on a piece of knit, ribbing, or fabric that will stretch. I'm going to adjust my sewing machine to the applique or satin stitch. This is very important. We need to make sure that we have a nice wide stitch, but very short in length. I'm going to begin in the middle of my sample piece, and you might note that I have pink thread in a spool on the top of the machine and pink thread as bobbin thread. When I stitch, I'm going to be stretching the ribbing. This will distort the ribbing, and I'll sew for a ways so that you can see what this will look like. I'm sewing right on the edge of the ribbing, on the fold, just as I would sew on the edge of the neckline on my sweatshirt. And I'm stretching both ahead and behind my work. You can see already we're getting a curl on the edge of the fold of the ribbing. And this is the look that we want. If I was doing this on a sweatshirt, I would actually go around 2 times to fill in the stitching. It gives it a very nice professional look to have extra thread added in. After you've practiced a little bit on a piece of fabric, it's time then to work on a sweatshirt. I think this pink thread will be a nice contrast on this lavender shirt as well. Notice the stretching that you need to do. Don't pussyfoot around here. Sometimes it's tempting not to really stretch, but you need to stretch the neckline to get the nice curling edge. There. I think you might like to consider the shirt tail bottom as an interesting way to alter the bottom edge of your sweatshirt. This will give you a little more flexibility in the bottom, and I know that many women especially enjoy the comfort of a shirt tail bottom where we remove the ribbing from a sweatshirt and the sweatshirt falls straight on the body. This is an easy alteration, and I'll show you how it's done here on another pink sweatshirt I have on my board. You'll notice that I have already removed the ribbing from the sweatshirt. Now this is not going to ever be added back on, so we can set this aside and possibly use it for another project. Here's the new straight bottom of the sweatshirt. And we're going to refer to the Designer Sweatshirt book again, to the section of patterns in the back. This is page 37. And you'll note that this is the facing pattern that we need for this alteration. I've made my tracing, and you'll notice again that V that we'll be using to stitch the facing in place. We used the V already when we did the front facing. I've cut 2 pieces of fabric, the same size as my facing pattern. And in addition, I've already turned back the edges and top of one of the facing pieces, and with my blue marking pen, I drew the V that I'll be using as a guide for stitching. This facing will be placed here on the exact side of the sweatshirt. I'll be pinning this into place here, and of course you'll have 2 of these, so the other one will be on the other side of the sweatshirt, naturally, I guess. And over here, I have already sewed this facing into place. Remember again, when we stitch that V, we stitch down, we stitch across 1 stitch, and then back up to our starting point. Now we're ready to cut open this facing. And we'll be turning the facing to the back side of the sweatshirt. It's important to anchor the corners of this facing in place so it won't pull out to the front of the shirt again. We want a very nice, neat look. And to cut corners and to avoid a little bit of stitching, you might like to take out your roll of stitch witchery, and you would cut some small pieces and place them behind the facing and fuse down so you hold the facing in place simply by ironing with stitch witchery. As a final step, I think you will be able to understand that we have now a long edge to cover with fabric. Looking back to our model again, I might show you that we have simply added fabric to the bottom, and it's a hidden facing beneath the sweatshirt. You will be measuring this line and cutting long strips of fabric a little longer than each side of the sweatshirt. The next step will be to pin these into place. You'll actually be pinning the right side of the fabric to face the right side of the sweatshirt. And next we will be able to sew this facing in place. After sewing, we'll simply flip it to the back side of the sweatshirt, and the facing will not be noticeable at all. Looking again at our model, you will possibly notice that I have top stitched from the right side of my garment so that my stitching looks nice and neat. I top stitched to hold the facing in place on the back side, and I stitched around the slits we've created on the side. I think this is a very neat and rather inconspicuous way to finish off the shirt tail bottom. You draw no attention to the bottom of this sweatshirt in this manner. But we do have one other option that I'd like to show you on another sweatshirt. We can leave some of the fabric showing when we complete this alteration. Here is my shirt tail edge. I have fabric showing. But ladies, please be aware of where this draws the eye. Any area we decorate on our sweatshirt is where someone will look. And if your hip line is less than ideal, it might not be the area that you'd like to decorate on a sweatshirt. So compare the two. If you like this look, please go right ahead. But you may prefer instead to do something similar to the model that we're showing here with the bright pink sweatshirt. Consider the shirt tail bottom. I think it's a very casual, nice, and comfortable alteration. Now you also may be interested in the neckline of this sweatshirt. You've probably realized that I've cut away the crew neck top, and so the neckline is a little larger, a little more open. Let's look at how this is done, just very briefly. On my pink sweatshirt, I have marked all the way around the neckline, 1 inch below the ribbing. I followed then by stitching along that line of marks all the way around the neck, and I'm going next to cut away the crew neckline. I'll be slicing away right above the stitching line all the way around the neck. Do you see how that opens up and makes a larger scoop neckline? This might be very comfortable for you. Next we have a piece of fabric that we'll use for our facing. And we can simply lay this new neckline over a piece of fabric, and we can draw in the curve that we have now created and cut some facings for this new neckline. Maybe this will give you a way to alter a sweatshirt for the summer, or for a time when you like a little more breathing space than what a normal crew neck has to offer. What you're seeing is an example of machine applique. This is one of the sewing techniques that's so very popular for creating designer sweatshirts. I'd like to talk about some of the techniques that we can use to make this go more smoothly and work so well with working with sweatshirt fleece and knits. We need to start off with the right equipment for this project. And the first item is the correct sized needle for our sewing machine. I have here a package of needles sized either 90 or 14. It's two different numbers for the same size needle. We can't see our sewing machine needles growing dull, so we need to be using and changing our needle very often. Next, we need to use the correct kind of thread, and we need to be using new thread. This is a standard sewing thread, and some of you may be tempted to use thread that you've inherited from Grandma. But the thread that she's used is probably old and brittle by now, and the most valuable part is the wooden part. So we're going to use new thread. We're going to take the time to match it carefully to the fabrics that we're using for applique, and this is what we will use at our sewing machine. Next, we have the correct presser foot. This is a clear plastic model. And the feature that it has that's important and useful for machine applique is on the back side, it has a groove cut into it. This allows the heavy stitching of machine applique to pass underneath more evenly and smoothly. Check your box of machine parts. You may have an applique foot or a satin stitch foot that will work very well for this project. Next, we're going to look at the machine and make an adjustment in our top tension. This will be a slight change to loosen the top tension. This will help to make the applique stitch look more professional, and we won't see the bobbin thread come through to the top side of the fabric if we loosen the top tension. If you're new to this project of machine applique, I think it's a great idea to practice first before working on a sweatshirt. So I've cut out some shapes, and I'd like to show you what I would do to practice for machine applique. This is sort of a strange looking set of shapes, but I would cut out a variety of shapes with different edges. We've got straight edges and curved edges that we're going to work around to build our skills. This is a piece of sweatshirt fleece. I've fused pieces of calico fabric onto the front of it, and on the back side I have pinned in place some tearaway pellon. This gives us a nice firm and stable base to work on while we're doing machine applique, and this will be torn away later after we're done stitching. But it's so important that it's here as we're working. So when I put my shapes under the machine to begin working, I'll choose this circle, and I'm going to work my way around all of these shapes to practice. I found when I began machine applique that I got a lot better the more that I did and the more practice time that I took. I'm covering the edge of the fabric with my stitching, and I'm trying to relax as I sit here. Sometimes when we start a new project, it's very tempting to tense up, but we really want to try to relax as much as possible. Think about relaxing your elbows and your shoulders, and more of you will have to relax then also. After you've taken time to practice at the sewing machine, you'll be ready to select a design and prepare a designer sweatshirt with an applique design. Here's how you might proceed. Here at the workboard, I have the designer sweatshirt book open to pages 32 and 33, and I'll use this ice cream cone pattern to show you how we'll work on this today. I have a piece of Wonder Under, which I will place over the design. You can see through it well enough to trace a design. On another piece, I've already traced each portion of the design. Notice each section is traced separately, and the ice cream cone part is traced a little bit taller so that I can overlap the designs to complete it on the sweatshirt. The next step will be to cut this piece apart into 3 sections and to fuse each piece of Wonder Under to a piece of fabric. I have a piece of pink pin dot fabric, and here is my ice cream section. I will place the fabric with the fabric down, the under on top of the fabric with the fusible side down, and then I will press and hold to fuse the design and the pattern onto the fabric. You have to be patient here. I will treat each of these three portions exactly the same so that I have then three parts of my design fused to fabric. I'll then use my scissor to cut the design shapes from the fabric. I'll peel the paper off, and my design is ready to apply to the garment. Here are my three pieces of the ice cream cone. My sweatshirt is ready, and I will lay it on my ironing board. Check to make sure that I'm working on the front, and position the design here in the center front. The cone section will be beneath the ice cream part, and the cherry goes, of course, on top. And next, I will press this design, press and hold, and fuse it onto the sweatshirt. Next, we will take this garment to the sewing machine to sew the design in place. I will add stitch and tear Pellon to the back of my work for that good stable work base, and then this design is going to be a very special part of this sweatshirt. In addition, in case that you like to work with your hands, with a hand sewing needle, I can show you another shirt with applique done by hand. Here the model has a tulip design completely stitched on by hand, and you'll notice also that I added trim to the hood of the shirt. Kind of a fun place to add trim. To prepare a design with hand applique, I can show you on a little sampler how this is done. First of all, I cut my design from lightweight fusible interfacing, and I fused this to the back side of some fabric and left a very small seam allowance all around the edge. This will be turned under, and of course this will be the right side that we will see on the garment. To attach this to the sweatshirt, I have a little sampler prepared where I have pinned the design onto the sweatshirt using small gold sequin pins. And I use thread to match the color of the applique fabric, and as I stitch, I turn back the edge so no raw edge is showing. This is very easy and fun, and you might find this a relaxing way to add applique to your designer sweatshirt. Seminole patchwork is a sewing technique developed by the Seminole Indians in Florida. We can make use of it for designer sweatshirts and create a very interesting look as trim. Here on the model we have a band of Seminole patchwork with two bordering fabrics, both above and below. I think this makes a very interesting look, and it's done with piecework. To show you how to make a band that's similar to this, I have my rotary mat and rotary cutter here to cut some strips of fabric. You'll see that I have a selection of strips cut already. You would cut a group of fabrics that look pleasing to the eye to you, and I have my ruler set on top of a piece of fabric so I can cut an 1¼ wide strip of this calico fabric for my Seminole patchwork. This system of cutting is very, very accurate and quick. You get a nice sharp edge on your fabric, and it's very accurately an 1¼ wide all the way across. The next job will be to sew these strips of fabric together to create a new band of fabric. I've done that on this little sampler to show you what this will look like. On the back side you will see my seam allowances are they are exactly 1/4 inch wide, and you must be very, very careful to be accurate with this piecework technique. And now I'm ready to do a little more cutting. I've already divided my strip into 1¼ wide divisions. I could go ahead to use my rotary cutter to cut these, but I will cut a few just by hand to show you how we place them together and prepare to sew. Though some people see this as a very tedious job, it goes quickly, and the most important thing, as I've said, is to be accurate. You will cut the whole band into these 1 1/4" sections, and then we'll sew them together again, but not as they were. I'm going to line up the second one 1/4 inch higher than the first one. I'll match them up over here on the back and place a pin, and I can take this to my sewing machine to sew down this side 1/4 inch seam. The third strip will be sewed on in the same way 1/4 inch up. It looks like you're building stair steps. And let me show you the final result. This is what you have after sewing the small pieces together. It's interesting the comments that you might get when you wear a piece of Seminole patchwork. Someone may say to you, "My gosh, are you ambitious, sewing all those little squares together?" But I think you can see that you're actually sewing strips of fabric, and it's not nearly as tedious as sewing little squares together. To finish this off a little more neatly, you may like to do as I've done for the vest, and that would be to add additional strips of fabric to seal the edges. This trim could be added to a pocket, to the front of a sweatshirt. You could possibly cut an applique shape out of the piecework. There are many, many possibilities, and I think that you would really enjoy what you can do with Seminole patchwork to create your own designer sweatshirt. Another technique that was used with the Seminole patchwork on this vest is double needle stitching. Here on the vest are 2 very even lines of stitching that are created with this double needle. I wish I had a dime for every woman who said to me, "You know, I got a double needle with my sewing machine, but I've never used it." I'd like to show you how very easy it is to use this double needle and add a very special touch to your sweatshirts. Here at the sewing machine, I'm prepared to sew on a little sampler to practice double needle stitching. You will notice that I have 2 spools of thread, and I have threaded these threads through each of the loops and tension springs. A thread comes out through each needle, and I'm ready to sew. You only need 1 bobbin thread. It will service both of the needles. Let's begin. I've drawn blue lines on my sampler so I have straight edges to guide my work, and I think you can see that a very small tuck is formed when these 2 needles stitch side by side. My silent partners are dressed in sweatshirts that illustrate waste canvas embroidery. On this sweatshirt, the gumball machine was completely embroidered by hand using waste canvas. On this shirt, only the collar is decorated. I chose floss color to match the sweatshirt color and simply added the embroidery around the edge of the collar. For many people who like simple details, this is a very attractive way to decorate a sweatshirt. Let's look at the way that we add waste canvas embroidery to a designer sweatshirt. Here you see the gumball machine that earlier I have applied to the sweatshirt. This is from a counted cross-stitch book, and so to show you how we work with waste canvas, I've chosen this small design here at the bottom with the hearts and flowers to illustrate this for you. First of all, we need to have some waste canvas, of course, and here are 2 samples. This is 14 count canvas. This is 18 count canvas. If you're familiar with counted cross-stitch, these terms are knowledgeable to you, and you know that 14 count canvas means that you will have larger X's or larger embroidery than you will have on 18 count. The first step is locating the design on the sweatshirt. Here I have determined that my heart and flowers design will be centered in the upper half of my sweatshirt, and I want it centered. So I drew a blue line with my washable marking pen and then centered the waste canvas on this line. I basted very carefully the waste canvas in place. I basted by hand, but another good way to do this is to baste by machine, and you could use a very large stitch to baste the canvas firmly onto the sweatshirt. This is a very important step. On the other side of the shirt, I can show you that I have embroidered that hearts and flowers design, and I'm nearly done. I have one more stitch to do, so I'll take care of that right now. I'm working the needle through the sweatshirt fabric and between the threads of the waste canvas, and I take my last stitch through to the back of the shirt where you can see my work and you can see my knots, and I'm going to knot this thread also. So I secure the end of it, and then I'll cut off the thread, and I'm ready to remove the waste canvas. The first step, of course, is to loosen the knots and to pull out these threads that you have earlier used for basting. Now, the waste canvas starts out very crisp and stiff when it's new. And at this point, it's still quite crisp. But what we will do next is to wet it. And I've got my squirt bottle of water again, and I'm going to get this very wet. I'm going to wet the canvas very thoroughly. And you can probably see that it becomes very soft and manageable, easy to handle. Now, one by one, I will remove the threads. And on the edges, removing the threads is very easy, so I can simply pull these away. But the more difficult threads to remove will be the ones that are in the center of the work. You haven't stitched through them, but you have embroidery floss going around the threads. So you may want to use a tweezer, and you will pull very carefully on these threads, one at a time, and pull them out to remove them. Here's the shirt with the waste canvas completely removed. The shirt is still a little wet, as you can see, but this will dry quickly. I think you can see that the effect of this is very neat and smooth. And I'd like you to think about the possibilities that this has for other garments as well. Let me show you a sweater that I've embroidered with a monogram and a circular floral design. This adds a lot of life to this plain gray cotton sweater. I'd like to encourage you to give waste canvas embroidery a try. It's a lot of fun and the look is very effective. I'd like to show you a few more ideas for sweatshirts, and I'll start with a few ideas for men. Here on the board I have a V-neck sweatshirt for a man, and the ideas featured on this one are very simple. I have 3 rows of double needle stitching, and over on the right is a small monogram done with waste canvas embroidery. I have to admit this isn't very splashy or flamboyant, but I feel that you have to be very careful when you're decorating for men. If you know his personality, you can make very good judgments, but my general advice is to go subtle, and these ideas tend to be very subtle. Another idea that you can transfer to a sweatshirt is found on this sweater for a man. On this sweater, I have used waste canvas embroidery to add a very small wood duck. This was done with 20 count waste canvas, and it was very fine work, but I like the effect. And the test is that he has worn the sweater, and that's what we want. We're making these sweatshirts to be worn, not to sit in the closet. Let's look at some other ideas for designer sweatshirts. We'll start off with stenciling. This is an old technique that has come back into style, And I have a small stencil here and an example of the stencil used on sweatshirt fleece. You could easily create an interesting sweatshirt by stenciling on it. There are any number of books that you can purchase that show you how to do this. It's easy and quick, and give it a consideration. Other little samplers that I have illustrate other uses of other kinds of fabrics. The red velour heart in the center is a washable fabric, and any fabric that's washable is certainly usable on designer sweatshirts. The rickrack is added as a detail, and I got that to stay very easily in place by using the glue stick to hold it down. And of course, there's always ribbon and lace. Another kind of fabric that's interesting is ultra suede. Here's a little sample of an apple cut from this very elegant fabric. Small pieces can make very nice applique designs. Another kind of fabric to consider is fake fur. Here we have a sheep, and this fuzzy little piece in the middle is fun for kids. And of course, we have a piece of black fake fur for that black sheep in the family. This little sweatshirt features riband, which is a counted cross-stitch product that we buy and then decorate with our own hand embroidery. It's a very simple little shirt, and often people do not consider buying gray sweatshirts for little girls, but this is a very attractive sweatshirt for a young lady. And then we can use washable yarn. Here I've braided some strands of brown yarn and tied ribbons on the end, and I'm going to go ahead to sew that around a little face. The buttons are the eyes, and this is a fun shirt for children as well. But if the little girl has curly hair, you can add this detail. I have wrapped some washable yarn around a piece of typing paper. I'll go ahead to sew on the middle of that strip, and I can show you on this sample what that will look like. And I will rip the paper away, and then I'm going to have a squiggle of curls to sew around this head. I'd like you to meet Maxine. She's wearing a human sweatshirt because it only makes sense that if humans can wear teddy bear sweatshirts, shouldn't a teddy bear be able to wear a human sweatshirt? Then we have grandmother's doilies. You may have a supply of these at home and not know what to do with them. Here I've placed one on a piece of lavender sweatshirt fleece to illustrate that this could become the design of a flower on the front of a sweatshirt or a medallion for a special pocket that you might add. Then we have fabrics with designs printed on them already. This quilting design could become a very attractive pocket on a sweatshirt. And another selection of designs I have is circular medallions of snowflakes. These could become an interesting yoke pattern around the neckline of a sweatshirt. I'm sure if you use your imagination, a lot more ideas will come to mind, and they'll add your special touch to a designer sweatshirt. As the final addition to your designer sweatshirt, don't forget to add the label with your name on it. This is your signature on your work of art. This is just a great sewing project, and I'm sure you will be very pleased at all the compliments you'll receive on your own designer sweatshirts.